Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our session today. It is my honor to have two of my favorite professors and thought leaders in healthcare in our country, Professor Regina Hertzlinger and Professor Barack Richmond. So I am Jimmy Childrey. I'm the former chair of Washington County Regional Medical Center and the former CEO. And my other occupation is my family's automobile dealerships in Central Georgia. Professor Hertzlinger is one of my favorite authors of healthcare materials and lecturers when I was a student. I think I read every article that she ever wrote about healthcare, which makes her my favorite healthcare professor that I never had as in the classroom. Regina is Professor Hertzlinger, Regina as she likes to be called, or Reggie, is the Nancy R. McPherson Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. She is actually named the godmother of consumer-driven healthcare. One, because she named the area, and two, of all the scholarly articles and books that she's written on the subject. In addition to being a teacher who has taught thousands of students at the Harvard Business School in the area of healthcare, she also is an accounting professor and has won the Best Teacher Award for her work in accounting. Professor Hertzlinger is a graduate of MIT. She earned her doctorate of business administration at Harvard Business School, and she was the first woman to receive tenure at Harvard Business School. Regina, welcome, and we're very glad to have you with us today.
What an honor to be here. Thank you.
Professor Barack Richmond also has a very distinguished career. He is the Catherine Bartlett Professor of Law at the Duke Law School and the Professor of Business Administration at the Fuqua School of Business. Professor Richmond's primary interest is in the area of economics, antitrust law, healthcare policy. He is a graduate of Brown University, Harvard Law School, and the University of California at Berkeley. He also has a diverse background. In addition, in his teaching areas, he has served as a clerk for the United States Courts of Appeal. He served on the international trade legislation as a staff member for the United States Senate. He's even done work for the NFL Coaches Association. Barack is a faculty member for the Health Sector Management faculty at Fuqua School of Business and is a senior fellow at the Kenan Institute of Ethics. He's won the Duke Law School Blueprint Award and was named Teacher of the Year in 2010. So Barack, welcome to you. And I'm looking forward to today's discussion.
Jimmy, thanks so much. And it's always great to be with Reggie as well.
So what interested me in this topic is I read your article in June when it was published in the Harvard Business Review, the title, Preparing Hospitals for the Next Pandemic. And I thought as I read through it, you bring out such interesting points. And one of them being, how do we have high demand, so much so that our demand for beds exceeds our supply, as it has in the spikes and in hot markets around the country during the pandemic. But at the same time, hospitals tend to lose money, or at least revenues fall substantially. So with that being the crux of the issue, and looking at the article that you published, I'd like for us to have a discussion on how can we better prepare hospitals to respond to these demand surges, and at the same time meet the population's healthcare needs, and to make it more challenging, how can we maintain financial viability? Brock, I'll start with you if you don't mind.
Sure. So, I mean, the way you phrase the question is exactly the right way to think about it. This is not a simple matter of if you don't have enough hospital beds, you should buy more hospital beds. You should have the government pay for more hospital beds. The way you phrase the question, which is that we have a surge in demand for hospital beds, with hospitals being unable to meet that surge in demand, but nonetheless, in their effort to meet current demand, they are running out of money. They are losing money. And in no well-working market is that the case. No well-working market do you have a surge in demand, incapacity to meet supply, and still losing money. the way you phrase the question illustrates that the problem we have, the problem we had last year and the problem we have right now goes to the very core of the way we finance hospital care in this country. So let's just pay a little bit of attention to what a normal market happens. In the normal market, if there's, I don't know, a surge of demand in oranges and a reduction in supply, you have prices going up. And those who are supplying oranges are making money in large part because demand has gone up. And you want that, because if providers of oranges are making money, that encourages others to find more oranges or grow more oranges. The pricing mechanism is a way of stimulating the right kind of activity, the kind of activity that you want in a marketplace so you can meet the surge in demand. And that's not what we have at all in the hospital sector. In fact, we have the opposite. We have efforts by hospitals not to meet demand because, well, these inpatients are not as lucrative as other hospital services, such as knee replacements or orthopedic procedures. So we have a hospital financing system that is insensitive to surges in demand, even when we are encountering a national problem. And what we have really is an illustration of how weak our safety net is. And we do not have a pricing mechanism that encourages hospitals to invest efforts to making sure that the safety net is better and meeting really acute demand right now. So because the problem goes to the very core of the hospital system, our diagnosis is the way we pay for hospital care. We overcompensate for acute care that's not always emergent. We undercompensate for inpatient care when there's real human need. We over-encourage hospitals to prepare for certain services where that tend to be lucrative, not exactly the kind of services that you really want a hospital safety net to invest in. And we under-incentivize investments to prepare for pandemics and prepare for when there's a surge of the demand that reflects real societal need. And we therefore encourage a real revisitation of not only the way hospitals are compensated, but also how hospitals are able to respond to demand surges. I mean, a lot of what's going on are hospitals not being able to exercise or capitalize on whatever little flexibility they have. So in short, this is not just a story about not having enough hospital beds. It's a story about a hospital business model that has the wrong incentives. It's a story about a financing model that's not responsive to consumer demand. And it's a regulatory system where hospitals are incapable or often hamstrung in being able to respond to market signals. So the severity of the tragedy that we're encountering right now should be matched by the ambitiousness that we have in trying to understand how deeply the problem goes.
So, Brock, as we looked at in certain markets, hospitals' beds were at full capacity. We built pop-up beds, pop-up hospitals to add beds. Sometimes those beds were filled and sometimes those beds weren't filled. So we tried to increase supply with more or less mediocre success in certain markets. So what are your thoughts about that? Does that help solve the problem if we add beds to a market area?
Well, that shows what kind of ingenuity is possible in a moment like now. When there's a need for more beds, but there are no current beds, there was a lot of effort trying to figure out how we can respond even when we're at full capacity. And one is pop-up hospitals, another is hospital care at home, another is trying to figure out how to shift available capacity. Very often the hospitals down the street had excess capacity, but none of this was part of a system that was dynamic. Very often the hospital that was overloaded didn't know that the hospital down the street had excess capacity. Very often, physicians who were dealing with patients in need of inpatient care didn't know that there were pop-up hospitals, and the availability of hospital care at home really is severed from our normal delivery system. All of these things could be very appropriate responses. In fact, actually, really ideal responses to a demand surge, but they're not incorporated into our broader healthcare system. And that reveals some inadequate financial incentives, but it also shows a lot of rigidity in our regulatory system. It's very hard, for example, to develop a pop-up system, a pop-up hospital, even in the face of a genuine emergency. And we also have a lot of regulatory barriers to allow hospital care at home, inpatient care at home, even though in some circumstances, for some patients, the cost and quality mix is actually superior to inpatient care at some hospitals. These are all things that stymie the hospital sector. And part of what's important about that is that we really don't have a hospital sector. We have individual hospitals that are not linked together, that do not have the capacity to cooperate together. I guess to a large degree, this is the theme of this conference, thinking about connections. We need to think about, as a policy matter, a way to interlink hospitals to create a hospital sector that is fluid, that is dynamic, that is responsive to societal needs. And that requires a different kind of regulatory infrastructure. I'll just say in passing that to some degree, although I certainly wouldn't build a railroad around this model, but to some degree, the nation's banks have the kind of systemic infrastructure that might offer some kind of blueprint for the hospitals. Banks can lend to each other. Banks can respond to market signals collectively. Banks can be regulated in ways where they are allowed to respond to demand surges and other economic shocks. And in that sense, we need to think about building a hospital system that is more robust, that is more dynamic, and really can respond to human need when there's a crisis.
Well, Brock, one thing we've noticed, first of all, I think it's fair to say we were all caught by surprise at the beginning of the pandemic. So we had a surge in demand. We had demand for certain items and supplies that we didn't have adequate supply for. And that promoted a system of hoarding where hospitals had to protect themselves. It caused disruptions in pricing in the marketplace for these supplies. We didn't always know from one hospital to the next who had supplies, who could lend supplies, or who had beds and where we could transfer patients. A lot of hospitals formed their own ad hoc groups to try to overcome these problems. So in the next part of the discussion, let's think about how do we develop a system whereby there's transparency to know where availability is and how we can better match up supply and demand. But I don't want to get too far away from another topic is we also know that part of the financial problem was, and you just touched on it, that lucrative services, the elective services were taken out of hospitals during the surge. We were left with high demand for services, the intensive care services that we lose money on many times, lost opportunity for the lucrative services. How do we think about this reimbursement model going forward so that we are caring for patients regardless of where the margins are and where the demand is? Okay, so I put a lot on the table with that.
So Jimmy, I'd like to respond to that question. For decades, I've railed against this pricing system, which is dictated by third parties and where the supplier has relatively little power to shape the prices to reflect the needs of their consumers. And frankly, I don't think it's going to change very soon. So the third parties, the insurers, the commercial insurers, the government, They set the prices, and that's the way it is. And I wish I could be more sanguine about the possibility of that being changed, but I personally am not. So I think we have to look at realistic solutions. And just to respond to Barack's point about the banks, banks can more or less freely price something the hospitals cannot do. So the banking sector, which functions pretty well, we pray to God that that's still true, seems to function pretty well. It's different from the hospitals in some part because they have this pricing power. So as I looked at this problem, I have a colleague, a female professor at the University of Minnesota. Her name is Pinar Karaka-Mandik, and Pinar did the awesome job of looking at the capacity utilization of hospitals all across the United States during the COVID epidemic, which unfortunately we seem to be back in the throes of. And what she found, for example, in one state is that the largest hospitals during a peak COVID period, ones with 583 beds, so that's not enormous, but pretty big. Two of them in this area were 30% occupied, and one of them was 92% occupied. Now, how does that make sense? It only makes sense if there's poor transparency and ability to communicate among the hospitals as to the amount of capacity they have that's being used or that's free to be used. And one solution to this problem of the lack of transparency is the solution that Franklin Delano Roosevelt imposed on the financial markets. And what he did is he created an agency, he called it the Truth Agency, and that was the SEC. So the SEC's role is partially to regulate financial markets, but it is also to provide transparency. And the FDR was advised by Louis Brandeis, the great Supreme Court Justice. Brandeis said, sunshine is the best of disinfectants, and what they were trying to cure were the problems in the financial markets. And I think the SEC, it's not flawless, nothing in life is flawless, but it's really done the job. So how did they do it? Well, one thing that the SEC does is it established standards for measurements of financial performance. It would be nice if hospitals had standard ways of measuring capacity and the utilization of capacity. Those data, these standards were created by a private nonprofit called the Financial Accounting Standards Board. And unlike any of the transparency agencies in healthcare, the Financial Accounting Standards Board is dominated by people who have no interest in any particular sector in the economy. They're just interested in measuring things right. So there's CFO, there are CFOs, there are accountants, there are people like that. So the FASB issues these standards. The big four accounting firms audit them to make sure that they're trustworthy. So we know when the government required price disclosure, which I personally think was a bad mistake, but it did require it. But the result was nothing. And in part, it was nothing because there are no standardized measures for how you disclose prices, the prices that you pay or unpaid. With the Financial Accounting Standards Board, with its uniform standards, it's very clear what something should be, what a price, for example, should be. And the data that are disclosed are audited, so they're trustworthy. They're also very accessible. So the SEC has data sites called EDGAR, and EDGAR is a massive data site. You can access it anytime, night or day, and has massive amounts of information. Yesterday, I'm writing a new book on innovating in healthcare, and I was coming to a chapter on accountability, and I went to the National Quality Forum's website. What do you think I found? I found the site was down. I found that the data that I wanted to look at were out for recuperation. You know, you would never find that with EDGAR, with the SEC's website. And one reason you wouldn't find it is it has a vast audience of financial analysts who make their living by interpreting the data that come from EDGAR. And these people are not just analysts, they're not only propeller heads. They're usually journalists like Bloomberg or the guy who started Morningstar. These are people who can take these arcane data and translate them so that people who are not as knowledgeable as they can understand them. So what happened in the financial markets? They got much more efficient. The cost of capital went down, the resource allocation became better, and all of that happened because there was great trustworthy, accessible transparency and people who could translate it. I would like that to happen for hospital capacity. I'd like it to be measured in a standardized way. I'd like the data to be audited so people would feel comfortable that these weren't fantasies, but were real data. I'd like them to be readily accessible, not most government data sites that I've looked at are missing mounds of data, or they're down, as happened with the NQF data site. And if we had all of that, there is an army of analysts from Moody's or Finch's or investment banks who would love to analyze that data. So what would have happened? I think what would happen is what Health Connect South wants to have happen. And that is if Hospital A knew that Hospital B was 30% occupied, they would get together and make more efficient use of their beds to treat the COVID population.
Virginia and Brock, I'm going to add something to this discussion. We are centered around the pandemic and the issues we face as healthcare providers during the pandemic. But what you're talking about also could apply to any natural disaster or industrial accidents or the next pandemic. Hopefully it never comes, where we can understand where capacity resides. And I'll add one to that. During non-pandemic, during normal times, as the CEO of a rural hospital, I realized that on any given day, in normal times, we have excess capacity, we have excess beds. And while we're trying to transfer a higher acuity patient to a larger medical center, they may be on diversion on that same day. Now, if their hospital was not taking some of the basic care that we can take in a rural hospital, then we can spread out this demand and have it served, this demand met where it can be met at the most efficient price and take care of excess capacity at the same time. And Brock,
That's exactly right. We need a much more flexible provider delivery system. We don't need more capacity in the event of an accident or a demand surge. And as you mentioned, it could, not necessarily a demand surge because of COVID. It could be a demand surge because of an industrial accident, and we have lots of burn victims, or, it could be a flood and lots of, I don't know, we need to treat people with lots of floods. So it's not a story about making sure we have more capacity. It's making sure we can meet demand surges. And also the flip side of that is also important, making sure that we don't have excess capacity when we don't need it. And you actually, Jimmy, even added an additional dimension, which is being able to use whatever capacity you have in the most efficient way. Having complicated patients receiving intensive care in places that best provide it, and people that don't need intensive care to other places. Maybe even those are the people who would get hospital care at home. So from the very beginning, we need to have a provider side that is much more dynamic, much more responsive to current demand, whatever that is, and also much more prepared for changes in current demand. And I think you do that in a number of different ways. First of all, you cannot rely on fee-for-service. You cannot rely on a system where everyone is trying to provide that knee replacement. You need to be able to prepare and have resources to prepare for the event of an emergency. So how does a hospital get compensated for care that it prepares for but never provides? And that's part of what a safety net is about. And I think the answer is there needs to be longer term contracts with payers, including the government. You need to have a responsibility and get compensated for having responsibility for a population, even in the event that a population does not need that care. And you also need to have a regulatory framework where you can expand and contract and adjust whatever provider or whatever you need to provide. You need the ability to provide pop-up care or care at home without needing to overcome regulatory hurdles. You need to be able to shift certain facilities from a standard of care to maybe whatever kind of care is demanded by a particular surge. And it's not always clear that credential organizations allow you to do that. So we need to think of ways to have a more flexible and far-sighted way of financing hospital care. And we need to give hospitals the leeway to not only meet whatever current demand there is, but also have the resources to anticipate for contingencies. And maybe even they get paid for having contingency plans. That's nothing that you get with fee-for-service. So a lot of what you're describing, being able to have a flexible system that uses its resources with utmost efficiency, or at least greater efficiency than we currently have, it requires a certain kind of rethinking of how we structure things and how we regulate things.
So I agree with what Rob says. Of course, we need to restructure, especially the pricing mechanism, and to let the handcuffs about changing capacity or even changing what it is that you do. We need to unlock those handcuffs. But right now, there's something very simple, and that is my colleague at the University of Minnesota went to enormous trouble to find out what hospitals had the excess capacity and which hospitals had tremendous needs for capacity. Those kinds of data, that's like 101 in running a business. And we don't have those kinds of data. And I think if the hospital community got together and said, we'd like this measured regularly, so we could know when we can shift or make capacity available, I think that would go a long way and is readily doable.
And, and Reggie, you've also written about using transparency tools farther upstream in the purchasing system. So it would also be very useful to know which hospitals have provided high quality emergency care, emergency pop-up inpatient care, which hospitals or which providers are very good at providing care at home. You also might want to know, as a purchaser of insurance, which insurance companies make sure that they contract with hospitals that have contingency plans. You want to make sure that you have an insurance plan that can take care of you in the event of an emergency, even if it's an emergency that fills everybody's hospital beds. If we live by the system where we encourage individuals to purchase insurance plans and to purchase hospital care with the information they need at the time of purchase, that would really inform the way the rest of our healthcare dollars are used.
So just to return to Jimmy's point, do we know which hospitals are great at treating high acuity needs? Well, I don't know. We may know reputationally that they're good at it, but call me funny. I like to look at real data, and it would be wonderful to have that kind of transparency that told us who is good at what, and when an emergency strikes, who has the capacity, who's good at handling that kind of problem. We don't have any of that, and that's pretty readily doable. What's lacking is the will of the hospital community to do it. And Barak, as you said, it could be very, very helpful in making transparent what insurance policies have contracts with hospitals that have contingency plans and which insurance policies don't have that. I think it would transform the insurance market and make it feasible to pay hospitals for having standby capacity, just as we do for utilities, for example.
Well, Regina and Barak, my hospital friends that are on with us today are probably bristle to think that there's another regulation coming or another level of transparency. However, I think all of us agree that our movement toward transparency in cost and our movement toward transparency in quality at each of our hospitals has been very good for the industry and for the patients. So if we can achieve this transparency of capacity, I think it's a relatively new concept, but we certainly understand the need for it more with the pandemic. I think that could be very helpful for all providers and all patients. I want to shift. Go ahead, Regina. You were about to...
There's research that shows that when nonprofit hospitals do things like have a standby capacity for pandemics, they get rewarded. They get rewarded by donations from people who value what it is that they're doing. And in this case, they would also get rewarded with insurance policies that pay them for it. And the reason they get rewarded is I'd buy an insurance policy like that assured me that I was dealing with an insurer who had a hospital network that they were paying for standby capacity.
That leads us to another interesting topic, and we've got a few minutes to touch on this. We started off talking about we had increases in demand and consequently volume, but we had drops in revenues. And we went from there to thinking about the third-party payer system we have in this industry, and that is primarily insurance. Y'all also wrote another article that I read in the Harvard Business Review, I think it is, give employees cash to purchase their own insurance. Could we talk just a minute about what would be required of the insurance industry, number one, if we could achieve this? And number two, what happens if employees do have more decision-making over their own insurance plans?
So I think what's needed is a law that would permit employers, most of whom are self-insured, to hand over the money they now spend on employee-sponsored health insurance to their employees on the condition that they use it to buy health insurance that meets the requirements of the ACA. And what that would do is greatly transform the insurance market. For example, I would love to buy an insurance policy that would reassure me that the network in the policy covers me if I should have a serious case of COVID and need to go to some hospital. And once I was looking for that kind of insurance policy, I would want some assurance that the hospital is really good in treating old ladies who have COVID, and it is not just reputationally good. So the ripple effect of consumers having the money to buy their own insurance rather than the very limited menu that's offered by their employers. Not blaming their employers, but the fact is that there are about 200 brands of yogurt. But when I buy health insurance, I have a choice of 2 or 3, and most people have a choice of 1. So when you let people loose on that market, it would transform the insurance industry, and it would also create greater transparency, which would be wonderful for everybody, including the hospitals.
And just to follow up on that, I mean, we are a long way off from having individuals really control where their healthcare dollars go, but it doesn't require a lot of effort. With an appropriate amount of information, which, as Reggie has described, and she's the accountant, but there's an abundant evidence for this, that we can standardize information, we can expose individuals to market signals and measures of quality and cost. Individuals with that kind of informational infrastructure, armed with that knowledge, will be able to make really valuable decisions for themselves. What we have right now instead are a series of intermediaries in our health system who make decisions for vast swaths of the population. By and large employers make decisions on behalf of their employees. Insurers make decisions on behalf of their insureds. These are large contracts they have with hospitals and other providers and pharma and PBMs and pharma manufacturers that really decide what is in the delivery system. And that concentration of power leads to all sorts of economic waste. We have lots of monopoly power in the system, but it also really dilutes the kind of dynamism that we can have in a private market. So we have millions and millions of Americans paying indirectly for their health care. If we give them appropriate flexibility and appropriate information, let them pay for it themselves. It's not just about individuals making decisions for their own. You're injecting about 100 million new individual purchasers into the healthcare sector. That's an extraordinary amount of dynamism. Instead of appealing to the one HR manager or the one manager of the PBM that creates the formulary, you have to appeal to thousands of individuals. It's an entirely different marketplace. And that's really what we're missing in the health sector. We're missing that kind of consumer hunger, that kind of demand for value. And if we were to have that through these, really just by unleashing consumers as they are, we can have a really dynamic marketplace.
And it goes back to what Barack spoke about so eloquently in the beginning of this talk. That is, that hospitals have to accept these kind of bizarre pricing formulas where some things are very lucrative and very important activities like caring for COVID patients are, if not money losers, they certainly diminish the profitability and the revenues of the hospitals. In a consumer-based market, that would never happen. Just being impossible. And the power of third parties, insurers, employers kind of dictate what it is that hospitals should be paid and what services they should offer, that would be greatly diminished.
On this topic, and Regina, I'll refer to you, you are considered the godmother of consumer-driven healthcare. And Barack, we've looked at how we can understand matching up supply and demand better through this thinking that we've come through with the pandemic. We've talked about insurance reform a little bit and how giving the consumer more decision-making authority over what they purchase and how it's used. Do you think these measures will help us bring down the cost of healthcare on a per capita basis or as a percent of our GDP? For all of our problems that we describe, we also recognize that we do spend more money than any of the other industrialized countries on healthcare, and sometimes we question ourselves on our outcomes. What do you think? Can we drive ourselves towards solving these problems and reducing the cost and not breaking the hospitals along the way?
So certainly consumer-driven markets are very efficient. Look at something like the automobile market, where the price of cars has gone down while the quality of cars, you guys are much too young to remember this, but my first car was a 17-foot long car, which stalled about every 100 miles, terribly unreliable.
You didn't buy it at Jimmy's store, though.
I had to buy it. I wasn't lucky enough to do that. Got about 8 miles to the gallon. So what do we have now, 50 years later? We have very efficient automobile industry. It's very profitable. And the price of cars relative to income has gone down. That's what happens when you have competition, you have consumer-driven markets. I don't know why. There's so many smart people in the healthcare sector, so many smart people in hospitals. I don't know why it wouldn't happen in hospitals either.
Well, Regina, I'll have to admit that when I came from my automobile background with my family's car dealerships, I'm a third generation. I grew up going to work with my dad, sitting on his knee while he sold cars. So, and I was on the sales force when I was 16 and I was a dealer when I was 25, a long time ago. But I have watched just what you're talking about. And I also, in the automobile business and the dealership business, we're in the distribution business. And that's what led me to thinking about hospitals and our distribution system and our arms race of investment with lower reimbursement. My first background led me to the questions in my second background. When I joined the hospital board and later became chairman, I thought, why does this work this way? We have an unsustainable business and we're just going to keep growing it in the direction we're growing.
Well, we have two solutions. One is to give it up and let the government take it over. So people confuse universal coverage with single payer. So I'm all for universal coverage, but you don't need the government to run the industry to achieve it.
Right.
You could also achieve universal coverage with a consumer-driven system, which, like our great industries, the yogurt industry, the car industry, name a consumer-driven industry. Prices have gone down relative to income, quality has increased. Let's try it in healthcare. I personally think that single payer, in addition, is just not viable. It's not going to happen. And we're bankrupting ourselves with our healthcare system. Not that it's not great, it's great, but it costs too much and it's inefficient. So let's try it the other way around. Let's make it consumer driven.
The other thing that having a consumer-driven system does is it puts everybody under a budget constraint. We all need to know that we need to conserve our healthcare dollars and we need to demand higher value and lower costs. We all need to shop around. We need to have the benefits of competition. And that might mean we don't go to the doctor that we want, or we don't go to the hospital that we want. But in those decisions, we are unlocking a lot of price competition, and that needs to be a collective effort. If we're always having somebody make our healthcare purchases on our behalf, we're not going to have the appropriate kind of skin in the game that we really need.
So people say, Josie Dozy, she's too dumb to buy healthcare. Just too hard. But look at the car. Look at a car. So a car used to be, I kind of understood how a car worked. The gas exploded and drove some part of the car and some shafts drove the wheel. I got it. Nowadays, the car is an advanced computer. When I see people pick up the hood and they're looking at what's at the motor, what the heck are you looking at? You have no idea how this car works. So how did that market with consumers who are essentially dumb about the product? Not because they're dumb, but because the product is so complicated, get to be better and cheaper. It's because of transparency. So I subscribe to Consumer Reports. I donate to Consumer Reports over and above that. And they're journalists. They have great data that tell me about qualities in a car that I care about, which is that it not be 17 feet long, that it be reliable, that it get reasonable miles per gallon, that my grandchildren will be safe when they ride in the car with me. So I'm smart, even though I have no idea how that car functions anymore because it's controlled by computers. So that's something that makes a consumer-driven market work, and something that would be great for healthcare as well for all participants, just like the car manufacturers. They did great as this transparency increased. They were profitable, they had better products, they had better satisfaction. Ralph Nader wasn't writing any more books about how terrible cars were. That's what happens in a consumer-driven market, which is enabled by good, reliable transparency.
Regina, on the point of transparency with the auto industry, I do remember far enough back that automobiles came without window stickers, without the
Yeah, there you
label.
go. There you go.
I do remember that, and I do remember some dealers were opposed to it when it happened. But once we got over that hill, you realize this transparency is good, and there's uniform pricing across the industry. Now each dealer can choose to make an amendment to that sticker, but it's transparent. It has the manufacturer sticker, and the dealer puts their own of what they want to charge.
Absolutely. Nowadays, they mark it up. Not you, Jimmy, but a lot of dealers do that.
Transparency can certainly be very good, and all stakeholders can be happy with it because we all learn from it and we adjust to the margins, and we can bring costs down that way.
We can't keep going the way we're going, and this COVID crisis just clarified it, that this distorted system has distorted the resources in the great hospital system. We spend so much money and we still can't get the care that we need. We need to go someplace else.
Well, I think this discussion has been very insightful by illustrating what we've learned from the pandemic and thinking about the solutions to the problems hospitals have had with the pandemic. And we titled the talk for the next pandemic, improving hospital efficiencies and operations for the next pandemic. However, we've also talked about issues that will help us improve day in and day out. Any closing comments, Regina or Barack?
You're a great moderator, and I wish I could have bought a car from you, my friend.
Regina, you still can. Thank you for the compliment. And we do have a few cars left, even for the.
I think that what Reggie closed on was absolutely perfect. That because we have all our signals crossed, we are wasting our resources in spite of spending extraordinary amounts of money, and our population is really suffering from it. So we can't go on like this.
Well, thanks to thought leaders like you, we get some good ideas for those of us that are in the practitioner world, the provider world, and you bring in other components and other stakeholders in the healthcare sector. I like to think of it as a sector, not just the providers. And this has been very helpful. I appreciate Health Connect South inviting us to do this panel today. And it has been a lot of fun to do this with two of my favorite people. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Okay.
And thank you to Health Connect South. It's performing such an important mission and doing it so well.
And I'll add that any of the three of us would be happy for anyone that would like to follow up with us and continue these discussions.
Absolutely.
These discussions are ongoing with the three of us, and we welcome anyone to join in and give us more information and better advice. Thank you both. Have a good day.